What if I told you that sometimes the truth doesn't disappear? It just waits, hidden in a place you never think to look, until the exact moment you're ready, or maybe not ready at all, to find it. Because that's exactly how it happened to me, not during some dramatic event, not during a moment of searching or questioning, but on an ordinary day that was supposed to pass just like every other day had for years, quiet. Predictable, untouched by anything unexpected, and maybe you've lived days like that too, where nothing changes, nothing surprises you, nothing interrupts the rhythm you've grown used to. And you start believing that everything important has already happened, that whatever secrets existed in your life have already been revealed, that there's nothing left to discover. And for a long time, I believed that because after my husband passed, life didn't just become quieter, it became simpler in a way that felt final, like the story had already been told and I was just living in what remained. And I accepted that not because I wanted to, but because it felt easier than imagining anything different. And over time, that acceptance turned into routine, and that routine turned into something that felt permanent, something that didn't leave room for surprises. And that's why what happened that day felt so out of place, because it didn't belong to the life I had been living. It didn't fit into the pattern I had grown comfortable with, and it started with something small. Something so ordinary that it shouldn't have mattered at all, just a drawer, one I had opened countless times before, one that held things I no longer paid attention to, things that had become part of the background of my life. Objects that existed without meaning because I had stopped looking at them closely, and I wasn't searching for anything specific that day. I wasn't trying to find something hidden or uncover something lost. I was simply moving through my routine, doing what I had always done, expecting nothing new, and that's what made it so unexpected, because sometimes the things that change everything don't appear when you're looking for them. They appear when you're not. And as I moved things aside, as I reached into that familiar space without thinking, my hand brushed against something that didn't feel the way I expected, something that didn't belong to the way everything else was arranged, and I paused. Just for a moment, because when something feels out of place in a life that has become so predictable, you notice it immediately. And I remember thinking it was nothing, just something I had forgotten about. Something old that didn't matter anymore, but even as I told myself that, something about it made me stop, made me look closer, because it wasn't just the object itself. It was where it was, how it was placed. How it had stayed hidden in plain sight for so long without ever drawing my attention. And that realization alone was enough to make me curious, because if it had been there all this time, how had I never seen it before? And maybe you felt that too, that strange moment where something familiar suddenly feels unfamiliar, like you're seeing it for the first time even though it's always been there. And that feeling, it stayed with me as I picked it up. As I turned it over in my hands, as I tried to understand why it felt different, and that's when I saw it clearly, something I hadn't expected at all, something that didn't fit into the quiet, settled version of my life. A letter sealed. Untouched, something that hadn't been opened, something that had been kept intentionally. And in that moment, everything inside me shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to make me aware that this wasn't just another object. This wasn't just something forgotten or misplaced. This was something that had been hidden, something that had been kept from me, and that realization, it brought with it a wave of questions I didn't have answers to. Questions that didn't belong to the life I had been living, because for years I had believed that everything between us had been known, understood, complete, and now I was holding something that challenged that belief completely. And I didn't know what to do with that, because when you've accepted your past as something finished, discovering something new about it feels like reopening something you thought was already closed, and that's not an easy thing to do. Not when you spent years finding peace in the idea that there was nothing left to uncover. And I stood there for longer than I should have, holding that letter, feeling the weight of it in a way that didn't match its size. Because it wasn't just paper, it was possibility, it was uncertainty. It was something that could change how I saw everything I thought I understood. And that kind of possibility, it's not easy to face because it comes with risk. The risk of learning something you weren't prepared to know, the risk of realizing that the story you believed in might not be as complete as you thought, and for a moment, I considered putting it back, leaving it exactly where I had found it. Choosing not to know, choosing to keep the life I had built around certainty intact, because not knowing, it's easier, it's safer, it doesn't ask anything from you, but knowing changes things. Knowing forces you to confront something real, something that can't be ignored once it's revealed, and I could feel that choice clearly in that moment. that quiet tension between staying where I was and stepping into something unknown. And that tension, it wasn't just about the letter, it was about what it represented, because opening it wouldn't just answer a question. It would create more. It would bring something into my life that hadn't been there before. Something I couldn't control, and as I stood there, caught between those two possibilities, I realized something that made the decision even harder. This letter wasn't meant to be found, not like this, not after all this time. Because if it had been meant for me, I would have seen it before, and that thought alone made everything feel heavier, because it meant one thing clearly: whatever was inside was never meant for me to read. And that realization didn't make me step back. It made me hesitate even more, because sometimes the things you weren't supposed to know are the ones that change everything the most. And standing there, holding something that had been hidden for years, I understood one thing with complete clarity: if I opened this, nothing would feel the same again. And yet, I couldn't ignore the question that had already taken hold in my mind. What was he trying to hide from me all this time? What if I told you that sometimes the hardest part isn't discovering something hidden? It's deciding whether you're ready to know what it means. Because standing there with that letter in my hands, I realized that this wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a choice, a quiet but powerful decision between staying in the life I had already accepted or stepping into something that could change it completely. And maybe you felt that too, that moment where curiosity and fear exist at the same time, where you want to know the truth, but you're not sure if you're ready for what it might reveal, because for years, I had lived with a certain understanding of my past, a version of my life that felt complete, that felt finished. And now, this letter was challenging that in a way I hadn't expected. Because if something had been hidden from me for so long, what else had I misunderstood? What else had I accepted without ever questioning it? And those thoughts, they didn't come all at once, they came slowly. Building with each second I held that letter, with each moment I delayed opening it, as if part of me was trying to protect myself from what might be inside, because once you know something, you can't unknow it. Once the truth is revealed, it becomes part of your reality whether you're ready for it or not, and I could feel that weight clearly now, not in the letter itself, but in what it represented. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything I believed about us, about our life, about the years we spent together, and that's what made it so difficult. Because opening this letter meant opening a part of my past I had already made peace with, and peace, even if it's incomplete, is hard to disturb, and for a moment I almost didn't open it. I almost placed it back exactly where I found it, convinced myself that it didn't matter, that whatever was inside had stayed hidden for a reason, that maybe it was better left that way. But even as I thought that, something inside me resisted, something refused to let it go. Because curiosity, real curiosity, doesn't fade just because you want it to, it stays, it grows. It pushes you forward even when you're not sure you should go, and that's exactly what it did, because no matter how much I tried to convince myself to leave it alone, I couldn't stop wondering. Couldn't stop imagining what might be written inside, couldn't stop questioning why it had been hidden in the first place, and those questions, they didn't give me peace, they created tension. A kind of restlessness that made it impossible to simply walk away, and that's when I realized something important. I had already crossed the line. Because the moment I started asking those questions, the moment I became aware that something existed that I didn't know, I had already stepped into the unknown, and the only way out now was through. And that realization made the decision clearer, not easier, but clearer, because leaving it unopened wouldn't bring me back to certainty. It would leave me in doubt, in curiosity, in a space where I would always wonder what I chose not to know, and that kind of wondering, it doesn't fade, it lingers, it follows you, it becomes part of how you think, and I wasn't sure I wanted that either. Because living with questions can be just as heavy as living with answers, and sometimes heavier, and standing there, caught between those two realities, I finally understood that there was no safe option anymore. No way to keep everything exactly as it was, because whether I opened the letter or not, something had already changed, something had already been disturbed, and with that realization, my hesitation shifted into something else. Something quieter, something more certain, because I knew now that avoiding it wouldn't protect me. It would only delay something inevitable, and slowly, without rushing, without fully trusting my decision, but knowing I had to make one, I opened it. And the moment that seal broke, something inside me reacted immediately, not because I knew what was inside, but because I understood that there was no going back now, and I unfolded the paper carefully, almost as if I was trying to slow down time, trying to hold on to that last moment before everything changed. and when my eyes finally moved across the first lines, I expected clarity, I expected something direct. Something that would immediately explain why this had been hidden, but instead, what I felt first was confusion, because the words didn't match what I thought I would find, they didn't reveal anything obvious, they didn't give me an answer right away. And that made it even more unsettling because when something is hidden for years, you expect the truth to be clear, you expect it to be undeniable. But this felt different, like it was leading somewhere instead of revealing everything at once. And that uncertainty, it pulled me in deeper because now I needed to understand, now I needed to read further, now I needed to see what I hadn't seen all these years. And as I continued, as each line unfolded into the next, I could feel something shifting inside me, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make me aware that this wasn't just a letter. It was something else entirely, something that carried more meaning than I had expected. Something that didn't fit into the version of him I thought I knew, and that realization, it stayed with me as I read, growing stronger with each word. Because the more I read, the more I understood that this wasn't just about something he hid. It was about something I never knew, and that difference, it changes everything. Because hiding something is one thing, but realizing you never even saw it coming, that's something else entirely. And as I stood there, holding that letter, reading words that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. This wasn't the man I thought I knew. What if I told you that the most unsettling truths aren't the ones that appear suddenly, but the ones that slowly unfold, piece by piece, until you realize you've been looking at something completely different from what you believed all along? Because as I continued reading that letter, I expected clarity. I expected a moment where everything would suddenly make sense, where one sentence would explain everything. But that's not how it happened. Instead, it pulled me deeper, line by line, thought by thought, into something I wasn't prepared for, something that didn't fit into the version of him I had carried with me for all these years. And maybe you've experienced that too. That strange feeling where something familiar starts to feel unfamiliar, not because it's entirely different, but because you're seeing it from a new angle, one you never considered before, and that's exactly what this felt like. Because the words weren't harsh, they weren't shocking in an obvious way, they were calm, measured, almost gentle, but the meaning behind them carried something heavier, something that made me pause more than once. Something that made me go back and read the same lines again just to make sure I understood them correctly, because it wasn't just what he was saying, it was what it implied, what it suggested about everything I thought I knew. And as those realizations started to form, I could feel something shifting inside me, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make me aware that this wasn't just a hidden letter, this was a hidden part of his life. A part that had existed alongside everything we shared, without me ever knowing it. And that realization alone, it's difficult to process, because when you've spent years believing you understood someone completely, discovering something you never saw changes more than just your perception of them. It changes your perception of your entire past, because now you start questioning things you never questioned before, moments you thought you understood, conversations you thought were complete. And I found myself doing exactly that, not intentionally, but naturally, because once doubt enters something you believed was certain, it doesn't stay contained, it spreads, it reaches into every memory, every moment, every detail, and asks the same question again and again. What else did I miss? And that question, it's not easy to sit with because it doesn't come with immediate answers. It comes with reflection, with uncertainty, with the uncomfortable realization that maybe the story you've been telling yourself isn't as complete as you thought. And as I continued reading, as I allowed myself to follow his words without trying to control what they meant, something else became clear. This wasn't written in anger. This wasn't written in regret in the way I expected. This was something deeper, something more complicated, something that carried a kind of honesty I hadn't expected to find. And that honesty, it made everything more difficult because it didn't allow me to dismiss it easily. It didn't allow me to see it as something simple or one-dimensional. It forced me to look at it fully, to understand it in a way I wasn't prepared for. And the more I read, the more I realized that this wasn't just about something he had hidden. It was about something he had carried, something he hadn't been able to say, something he had kept inside for reasons I didn't fully understand yet. And that difference, it matters, because hiding something out of intention is one thing, but holding onto something you can't express, that's something else entirely. And as that thought settled in, I could feel my perspective shifting again, not toward clarity yet, but toward something closer to awareness, because now I wasn't just reading his words, I was trying to understand the silence behind them. The reasons they had never been spoken, the space they had occupied all these years without ever becoming part of our life together, and that understanding, it doesn't come easily. It requires you to step outside of what you believed, to look at things without the comfort of certainty, to accept that there might be layers you never saw. And as I stood there, holding that letter, reading words that felt heavier with each line, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. This wasn't just revealing something new, it was reshaping everything I thought I already knew. And that kind of realization, it doesn't come with immediate emotion. It doesn't hit you all at once. It builds slowly, quietly, until it reaches a point where you can't ignore it anymore. And I could feel that point getting closer because the more I read, the more I understood that I hadn't reached the truth yet. I had only just begun to uncover it, and that thought alone made everything feel heavier, because if this was just the beginning, then what was still left to discover? And as my eyes moved to the next lines, as I prepared myself for whatever was coming next, I felt something I hadn't expected at all: hesitation, not because I wanted to stop, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to continue. And that hesitation told me something important. Whatever came next was going to change everything. What if I told you that sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself all at once? It waits until you're already deep inside it, until you've already questioned everything you thought you knew. And only then does it show you the part you were never prepared to see, because that's exactly what happened as I kept reading, as I moved past those first layers of confusion and realization into something much deeper. Something that didn't just challenge my understanding, it reshaped it completely. And maybe you felt that before, that moment where a story you thought you understood suddenly shifts, not because new information appears, but because the meaning behind it changes in a way you didn't expect. And that's what those next lines did, because they didn't just add to what I had read, they changed how I saw everything that came before them. And I could feel it immediately, that shift, that quiet but undeniable moment where something inside me paused, like my mind was trying to catch up to what my eyes were seeing, because this wasn't just a detail, this was something bigger. Something that explained why this letter had been hidden, something that gave context to everything I had been trying to understand up until now. And as that realization started to form, I felt something I hadn't expected, not just confusion, not just curiosity, but something heavier, something closer to disbelief, because what I was reading didn't fit into the life I remembered. It didn't align with the version of him I had carried with me all these years, and that disconnect, it's difficult to process, because when something contradicts what you believe so completely, your first instinct isn't to accept it. It's to question it, to look for another explanation, to wonder if you're misunderstanding something. And I found myself doing exactly that, reading the same lines again, slower this time, more carefully, as if the meaning might change if I looked at it differently, but it didn't. It stayed the same, clear in a way that left no room for interpretation. And that clarity, it made everything heavier because now I couldn't dismiss it. I couldn't explain it away, I couldn't pretend it meant something else. And that's when it truly hit me, not suddenly, not dramatically, but deeply, in a way that settled into me and refused to move. This wasn't just something he had hidden. This was something he had lived with, something he had carried alongside our life together without ever sharing it with me. And that realization, it's not easy to accept, because it forces you to confront something uncomfortable, something that challenges the idea that you knew everything about someone, something that introduces a part of their life that existed without your awareness. And as that understanding grew, as I allowed myself to see it for what it was instead of what I wanted it to be, I felt something else begin to rise, not anger, not yet, but something quieter, something more complicated, a kind of sadness, not just for what I was reading, but for what it meant. For the silence that had existed between us without me ever noticing it, for the words that had been written but never spoken, for the truth that had been kept hidden even in the moments we shared. And that sadness, it didn't overwhelm me. It settled in slowly, like a realization that takes time to fully reach you, because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about us, about everything we had built together, about whether there were parts of it that weren't as complete as I had believed. And that thought alone was enough to make me pause again, to step back from the letter for just a moment. Not because I wanted to stop, but because I needed to understand what this meant before I could continue. And standing there, holding something that was changing my entire perspective in ways I hadn't expected, I realized something that made everything even more complicated. This wasn't just about what he had done, it was about why he had never told me, and that question, it carried more weight than anything else. Because it wasn't just about the truth itself, it was about the silence surrounding it, the decision to keep it hidden, the choice to let it remain unknown even when there were opportunities to reveal it. And as I stood there, caught between understanding and disbelief, between what I knew and what I was now discovering, I couldn't stop that question from repeating in my mind, growing stronger with each second. Why did he never tell me this? And as I looked back down at the letter, as I prepared myself to keep reading, I knew one thing with complete certainty. Whatever came next would answer that question. But it would also change everything I thought I understood about our life together. What if I told you that the moment everything finally makes sense is also the moment everything feels the most broken? Because as I kept reading, as I moved past the disbelief and into something deeper, something more complete, I realized that this wasn't just about uncovering a secret anymore. It was about understanding a truth that had been there all along, hidden not in what was said, but in what was never said. And maybe you felt that too, that realization that comes too late, where pieces suddenly fall into place and you see something clearly for the first time, but by then, there's nothing you can do to change it. And that's exactly what this felt like, because the more I read, the more I began to recognize things I had once overlooked. Moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but now carried a different meaning, a deeper layer I had never considered. And that shift, it didn't happen instantly. It built slowly, line by line, memory by memory, until it reached a point where I couldn't ignore it anymore, because suddenly everything I thought I understood about our life together started to feel incomplete, not wrong, but unfinished. Like I had only ever seen one side of something that had always been more complicated than I realized. And that realization, it's difficult to accept, because it doesn't just change how you see the past. It changes how you feel about it, it reshapes memories, it adds weight to moments that once felt simple, and I found myself going back in my mind, revisiting things I hadn't thought about in years, looking at them through this new understanding, trying to see what I had missed, trying to understand how something so important could have existed without me ever noticing it. And that question, it didn't come with answers, it came with emotion, a kind of heaviness that settled deeper with each realization, because now I wasn't just reading his words, I was feeling their impact, not just intellectually, but emotionally in a way that reached into parts of me I hadn't expected to revisit. And as that feeling grew, as the truth became clearer, something else began to surface: regret, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, persistent. The kind that doesn't come from something you did wrong, but from something you didn't know, something you didn't see when you had the chance. And that kind of regret, it's harder to process because it doesn't come with a clear moment you can point to. It exists in possibilities, in what ifs, in the realization that there were things you might have understood differently if only you had known. And standing there, holding that letter, I could feel that regret building. Not just for what he had hidden, but for what I had never noticed, because now I could see it, now I could understand it. Now I could feel the weight of something that had been part of our life without ever being spoken. And that understanding, it changed everything, because it made me realize that the story I had believed in, the one I had carried with me for years, wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete either, and that difference, it matters. Because completeness gives you closure, it gives you peace. It allows you to move forward without questions. But now, there were questions not about what had happened, but about what had never been shared. And those questions didn't demand answers anymore. They demanded acceptance, because the truth was already there, written in his words, laid out in a way that couldn't be undone, and all I could do now was understand it. And as I reached the final part of the letter, as I felt everything coming together into something I hadn't expected but could no longer deny, I realized something that hit harder than anything else so far. This wasn't just about him anymore, this was about me, about how I had lived with a version of the truth that felt complete but wasn't, about how I had moved forward believing there was nothing left to discover. And now, everything felt different, not because my life had changed, but because my understanding of it had, and that kind of change, it stays with you. It reshapes how you see everything that came before it. And as I stood there, holding that letter, feeling the weight of everything I had just learned, I understood one thing with complete clarity. Everything I believed about our life together was incomplete, and the hardest part wasn't discovering that truth. It was realizing there was nothing I could do about it now. What if I told you that sometimes the most powerful words are the ones written at the very end, the ones you weren't prepared to read, the ones that don't just explain everything, but change how you feel about everything that came before. Because as I reached the final lines of that letter, I could feel it building, that quiet sense that something important was about to be revealed, something that would tie everything together. Something that would answer the question that had been repeating in my mind since the moment I started reading. Why, and maybe you felt that too, that moment where you know you're close to understanding something fully, where the truth is just within reach and there's a part of you that wants to slow down, to delay it just a little longer because once you know, everything changes, and that's exactly how it felt. Because I wasn't just reading anymore, I was preparing for whatever those final words would bring, for whatever meaning they would add to everything I had already discovered, and as my eyes moved across those last lines, I felt something shift immediately, not gradually, not subtly, but deeply, because this wasn't just an explanation. It was a confession, not in the way I expected, not something dramatic or overwhelming, but something honest. Something that carried a kind of vulnerability I had never seen from him before. Something that made everything I had read suddenly make sense in a way it hadn't before. And that understanding, it didn't come with relief. It came with something heavier, something more complicated, because now I knew, now I understood not just what he had hidden, but why he had hidden it, and that why it changed everything, because it wasn't about deception in the way I had imagined. It wasn't about something meant to hurt me or keep me in the dark. It was about something he couldn't bring himself to say, something he carried quietly, something he believed was better left unspoken. And that realization, it's difficult to process because it forces you to see someone not just as you knew them, but as they truly were, with all the parts they showed and all the parts they didn't. And as I stood there, reading those final words, I felt something I hadn't expected at all. Understanding, not complete, not perfect, but enough to soften the sharp edges of what I had been feeling. Enough to make me see that this wasn't just a secret, it was a silence that had existed for reasons I was only now beginning to understand, and that understanding, it didn't erase the sadness, it didn't remove the regret. It didn't make everything feel okay, but it changed how I held those feelings, it gave them context, it gave them meaning, and that meaning, it matters because without it, everything feels fragmented, everything feels incomplete. And now, even though the truth was heavy, it was whole, and as I reached the very last line, as I saw the final words he had written, I felt something settle inside me, not closure exactly, but something close to it. Something that allowed me to breathe differently, to think differently, to feel differently about everything I had just learned, because those last words weren't just about the past, they were about me, about how I would carry this forward, about what this truth would mean in the life I was still living. And that realization, it's powerful because it shifts the focus from what was hidden to what you do with it now. And standing there, holding something that had changed how I saw everything, I realized something that stayed with me longer than anything else. I wished I had known this sooner. Not so I could change what had happened, but so I could have understood him differently when it still mattered. And that thought, it's not easy to sit with because it lives in that space between what was and what could have been. A space that doesn't offer answers, only reflection, only acceptance, only the quiet understanding that some truths come too late to change anything, but not too late to mean something. And as I folded that letter slowly, as I held it in my hands one last time, I understood one thing with complete clarity. I couldn't go back to who I was before I read it because this truth, it had already become part of me. And now I had to decide what that meant for everything that came next. What if I told you that sometimes the truth doesn't give you closure? It gives you a choice. Because after I finished that letter, after every word had settled into something real, something I couldn't undo, I didn't feel the kind of ending I expected. There was no clear sense of relief, no simple resolution, just a quiet stillness that felt different from anything I had experienced before. Like everything had shifted, but nothing had fully settled yet. And maybe you felt that too. That moment after something important is revealed where you're left not with answers, but with understanding, and understanding is heavier than answers. Because it stays with you, it reshapes how you see everything. It doesn't close the story, it deepens it. And that's exactly what this did to me. Because now I wasn't just thinking about what he had written. I was thinking about what it meant for me, for the life I had been living, for the version of our story I had carried with me all these years. And that's when I realized something that changed everything moving forward. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about how I chose to hold this truth, because there are two ways you can carry something like this. You can hold on to the regret, the questions, the feeling that something was incomplete, that something was taken from you, or you can hold on to the understanding, the meaning behind what was never said. The realization that even silence can carry intention, and that choice, it's not easy because both sides are real, both sides are valid, both sides exist at the same time, and standing there with that letter still in my hands. I could feel both of them pulling at me, the part of me that wished I had known, that wished things had been different, that wished I had seen what I hadn't seen, and the part of me that understood, that recognized the reasons behind his silence. That saw the truth not as something meant to hurt me, but as something he didn't know how to share, and that conflict, it didn't resolve itself instantly. It stayed there, quiet but present, asking me to decide how I would move forward with this. And that's when something shifted inside me, not dramatically, not suddenly, but clearly. Because I realized something that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. The past doesn't change just because you see it differently, but how you carry it, that changes everything. And that realization gave me something I didn't expect, a sense of control, not over what had happened, but over what it meant now, because I couldn't go back and ask him why. I couldn't change the fact that he had kept this hidden. I couldn't rewrite anything that had already been lived, but I could decide what this truth would become for me, whether it would stay as something heavy, something unresolved, something that left me with more questions than answers, or whether it would become something else, something that added depth instead of taking something away, something that allowed me to see him and us in a way that felt more complete. Even if it came later than it should have, and that decision, it didn't erase the sadness, it didn't remove the regret completely, but it softened it, it changed its shape, it made it something I could carry without it weighing me down the same way. And as I stood there, no longer reading, no longer searching for answers, just holding onto what I now understood, I realized something that felt both simple and profound at the same time. This letter didn't just reveal a truth, it gave me a different way to remember him, not just as the man I thought I knew, but as someone more complex. More human, someone who had his own fears, his own silence, his own things he couldn't say, and that perspective, it changed everything because it replaced certainty with understanding, and understanding, it allows you to move forward differently. And as I carefully placed that letter back where I had found it, not hidden anymore, not forgotten, but acknowledged, I felt something settle inside me, not an ending, but a quiet acceptance. The kind that doesn't come from everything being resolved, but from knowing that you've seen the truth fully and chosen how to carry it. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves you with. The one I didn't ask myself until everything had already changed. If you discovered a truth about someone you loved, years too late, would you hold on to what was missing, or would you choose to understand what was always there, even if you didn't see it at the time?